Welcome to Session 6 of On Your Mark, Get Set, Grow. The purpose of this series is to help participants grow in their understanding of Mark's Gospel and the messages that Mark shared, to apply it to their lives, and do it in a safe setting. Each of these small groups corresponds with a sermon that I'm sharing on Sundays during Lent at Chain of Lakes. Come and join us for worship. In this last session, we're going to look at the final week of the life of Jesus as Mark portrayed it. We can learn a lot about each gospel writer by looking at how many chapters of story they gave to the final week of the life of Jesus. It's not that hard to remember. Matthew had 28 chapters. He started the final week in the 21st chapter. 7 chapters he devoted. Luke, 24 total chapters. He started the story in the 19th chapter. 5 chapters he gave it. John, 21 total chapters. He started the story in the 12th chapter. 9 total chapters. And Mark, the shortest gospel, 16 chapters, he started it in the 11th chapter, only 5 chapters. So Mark and Luke had the shortest portions of the final week. This makes sense. As I've shared, Mark is the shortest gospel of the 4. Mark started out the story when Jesus came into Jerusalem on a colt in Mark 11, and people were waving palms. People were anticipating a king. It was Passover, and there were 4 times as many people in Jerusalem as normal. Now, Blaine has 55,000 to 60,000 people. Imagine if 4 times that amount were in our city, 240,000 people. What would it be like? That was Jerusalem in the final week. Jesus entered into this cauldron of energy and tension and uncertainty. He came into Jerusalem on a colt. He asked his disciples to bring one to him that no one had ever rode. Now we might ask the question, why was this important to Jesus? Well, a prophet by the name of Zechariah, hundreds of years earlier, had said that a king would come into Jerusalem on a donkey. Jesus then, according to Mark, identified himself as a king by getting on this donkey. And as we've learned in Mark, he was the Son of God. So when Jesus got into Jerusalem, he went to the temple. This was not an accident, as Jesus spent a lot of time this last week of his life in the temple. The next day, he came to the temple and drove out the money changers who were buying and selling in the temple. He overturned the tables. That week, he had conversations with chief priests and scribes, really debate where? In the temple. Religious leaders challenged Jesus about the authority that he had and whether the people should pay taxes and whether there was a resurrection. Where would they do this? In the temple. And Jesus shared his famous teaching in Mark 12 about loving God and your neighbor as yourself. Where? In the temple. So why is it important that Jesus spent so much time in the temple? Well, to get at this question, let's look at a little history. In fact, let's go all the way back to the story of Moses in the wilderness, the 33rd chapter. In that story, the Israelites were in the wilderness. They set up camp. Moses would pitch a tent outside of the camp. It was called a tent of meeting. Everyone who sought the Lord would go to the tent. Whenever Moses went to the tent, all the people in the camp would stand and watch Moses until Moses went into the tent of meeting. When Moses entered the tent, a cloud would descend on the entrance of the tent. Moses and God would talk. There was this history in Israel of a location where people would encounter God. David, hundreds of years later, wanted to build a temple for God, but God told Nathan, the priest at the time, that David did not need to build a temple for God. Instead, God told Nathan that God was going to establish God's kingdom through David's offspring. This is an important story in the Old Testament, 2 Samuel 7. Solomon built the first temple in the year 953. It was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in 587. This was a terrible crisis when the temple was first destroyed in the nation of Israel. The temple was rebuilt in the year 516. We can read this story in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. The temple was not as grand when it was rebuilt the second time. Herod then We remember Herod. He was the leader who lived when Jesus was born and killed all of the children, the young boys near Jerusalem. Herod expanded the temple, vastly expanded. So this is what Jesus encountered when he was an adult in the final week of his life. So there was this vast complex, 169,000 square yards, 35 acres, 4 times the size of the property of Chain of Lakes Church. There were many courts into the temple. Priests would go and sacrifice there twice a day. We might remember the story of Zechariah. He was a priest. It's in the start of Luke. He drew a lot to go and offer a sacrifice to God. And while he was in the temple, the angel Gabriel came and told him that John the Baptist would be born. Priests then would go into the temple and offer sacrifices. The temple was more than a building. People looked at it as a residence for God. The inner sanctuary was the most holy of holy. The high priest would only enter this space once a year on the Day of Atonement. People didn't worship in the temple like we understand worship. Instead, they would bring sacrifices or an offering. 4 times the males would have to come to Jerusalem to offer these sacrifices or offering at the temple. In the year 70, the temple that Herod had refurbished was destroyed by the Emperor Titus. It was burned to the ground. The temple was a religious symbol for when Jesus lived. We don't have a comparative religious symbol for us today. We do have a political symbol. Think of the Capitol in Washington, D.C., and think what we would go through if the Capitol building was destroyed by an invading army. That was the circumstances that took place around the time that Mark was written. There was chaos. So when Jesus went to the temple and shared a different message, it was as if he was saying, we don't need the temple anymore. There's another message that is more important. This was an almost revolutionary teaching that came through Mark. Jesus was reforming religion. No longer did people have to go to the temple 4 times a year because there was no temple to go to. So how would they follow Jesus? Well, there was a new way. They would love God with all their heart, soul, and mind, and they would love their neighbor as they loved themselves. Another example of this is right after Jesus died, the curtain that covered the Holy Holies was torn in 2. So this meant that people didn't have to come to the temple to come into contact with God anymore. There is no need for the Holy of Holies. People could come into contact with God without going to the temple. This was very important for the time of Mark. The temple had been the foundation of religious life. Now Jesus was saying there was a new foundation. It was through me and the message of love that I am sharing. The events that we remember about the last week of Jesus' life took place in the 14th and 15th chapters of Mark. And it's worth remembering what happened. In those 2 chapters, Jesus celebrated the Passover with his disciples. While he was there, he said that one of the people present would betray him, and we know that person is Judas. Jesus broke bread and gave the cup to the disciples, starting the ritual of Holy Communion. Jesus predicted that Peter would deny him 3 times. Jesus went to the garden then of Gethsemane to pray, and while he was there, his disciples fell asleep. While he was in the garden, Judas brought a crowd, and they arrested Jesus. Jesus was taken to the Sanhedrin for a trial, and while he was there, he shared he was the Messiah, and then he was condemned to death. Peter, while Jesus was in front of the Sanhedrin, denied Jesus, just as Jesus had predicted. The next day, Jesus was taken before Pilate. After that interrogation, Pilate asked the crowd who had gathered if he should release Jesus. The crowd instead shouted out, "Crucify him!" Pilate asked the crowd, "Why? What has he done?" The crowd ignored Pilate's question, "Crucify him." Instead of releasing Jesus, Pilate released Barabbas. Jesus was handed over to be crucified. The soldiers were in charge of the walk of Jesus to the cross. They found Simon of Cyrene, who was told to take up the cross. Jesus was nailed to a cross between 2 other bandits. Mark wrote that it was 9 a.m. when Jesus was crucified. At noon, darkness came over the land until 3 o'clock. At 3, Jesus cried out, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus then died, and then the curtain of the temple was torn in two. The centurion, the man who was in charge of executing Jesus, saw what happened, and the centurion, the person who helped kill Jesus, said, truly, this was God's Son. Joseph of Arimathea then took the body of Jesus from the cross and placed it in a cave. After the next day, the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Salome brought spices to the place where the body of Jesus was put. And when they got there, Jesus was not there. Instead, they found a young man dressed in a white robe. He said 17 words. Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. The woman ran from the tomb. And this last section is important for us to remember. For terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. That's a strange way to end the story. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Mark 16:8. People have struggled with this ending ever since it was written. Some people have thought maybe the rest of Mark has been lost. There's two parts to this last part. If you open up your Bible, you'll see the story ends with Mark, and then you'll see a shorter ending and a longer ending. Those have been added by people after Mark wrote because it was so confusing to have the story end for people saying nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. We might ask, what does this mean to us? Well, what it means to us, I think, is each generation is called to speak up about the gospel, to demonstrate it in their lives. Because if people didn't say anything because they were afraid, the gospel would stop. So it's as if Mark was saying, it's up to you now to take this message and live it out in your lives so people can see the kingdom of God and come to know Jesus. The consensus of people who study these texts for a living have come to believe that Mark really ended at Mark 16:8. And the two endings were added to share what the early church believed. This last week of Jesus is just an amazing story. And it helps us as we go through our day. This message of Mark was shared amidst great chaos. And it was a message that gave people permanence and stability amidst the chaos. If we are experiencing chaos in our lives, can take this message for ourselves. So, in these sessions of Mark, what have we learned? Well, we've learned about the basics of Mark. We learned what it means to say Jesus is Son of God. We've learned what it means to live out the kingdom. We've learned about resistance to Jesus. We've learned what it means to be a disciple or a follower of Jesus. And finally, we've learned what it means for the last week of Jesus and what that means for us. In studying this message, we can see that the Gospel of Mark applies to us today, is just as relevant in today's world as it was when Mark wrote it. We can grow by learning and understanding this message. So, thank you for participating, and as you go forth, may you always remember the message, on your mark, get set, grow.